So I was saying that I would like to speak on the ambiguity of the Greek term martyrion, which signifies both witness, testimony, but also martyrdom. I'm interested in focusing on St. Paul's expression, the testimony of our conscience, το μαρτύριον της συνειδήσεως ημών, from the second letter to the Romans, and how this expression has come to mean not only the approbation of one's conscience, but also in patristic exegesis, dating back to Origen, a hidden martyrdom, an experience of suffering and death that is open to the life of interiority and perhaps makes such an interiority possible. Writing during the persecution of Maximinus, Origen already recognizes two forms of martyrdom. That's from his exhortation to martyrdom. One visible and of anero, as he says, the other hidden and of crypto. The latter is identified with the martyrdom that conscience undergoes not once, but every day, alluding to the psalmist's verse, "Yet for your sake we face death all day long, we are considered as sheep to be slaughtered." In what does this martyrdom of the conscience consist? According to Origen, it takes the form of a judgment. In reading the well-known passage from the letter to the Hebrews, "For the word of God is alive and active, sharper than any double-edged sword, it penetrates even to dividing soul and spirit, joints and marrow. It judges the thoughts and attitudes of the heart." Origen sees in that judgment of the thought and attitudes of the heart a self-judgment. That will take its final and fullest form at the last judgment. The last judgment, therefore, will take place in the form of a self-examination and self-condemnation within each one of us, inasmuch as each one of us will bear witness against the evil in us. Here the two senses of the word martyrion, that is, the bearing of witness and of martyrdom, coincide inasmuch as he who bears witness and he against whom the witness is borne and therefore has to undergo a certain suffering is one and the same person. Thus Origen refers to a division, the heresies, that is followed by a separation, horismos, and even a bifurcation, dichotomisis, of oneself from oneself. This idea, found in Origen, receives a more systematic treatment in the 8th letter of Pavel Florensky's The Pillar and the Ground of the Truth. I remind you that the 8th letter bears the title *Iemena* and discusses the last judgment, which for Florensky, quote, is a separation, a cutting off, an isolating. Here, again, we find a terminology very similar to that of Origen's. Florensky elaborates further as to what such a separation means, and I quote, "It is therefore clear," he writes, "that salvation postulates a separation between person and character. A person's evil will, manifested in the lusts and pride of the character, is separated from the person himself." Florensky reads all the eschatological passages of the Gospel in this sense, that is, as describing how the selfhood of the condemned man perceives the judgment of his subjective experience of this judgment. For Florensky too, what is to receive a final form of the end of times begins already in this life. Such, though voluntary, cutting off or uprooting of the sinful part from the empirical person is necessary even in this life. My aim, then, is to examine how these two meanings, namely of being a witness and of bearing witness to a truth or an event, connect with each other and with the concept of the conscience. The term witness in English at least, etymologically, originates from the verb to wit, that is, to know, in particular in the sense of sense perception, to see, from the Latin verb videre. Witnessing presupposes knowing, and indeed a theoretical knowledge, a certain form of seeing. Therefore, a witness is always a witness of what is seen and of what has shown itself, that is, of a phenomenon. More specifically, witnessing is to wit, that is to say the phenomena. Therefore, we can say a phenomenology. By allowing witness to be understood as a phenomenology, that is, as an articulation, a logos of the phenomena, of what manifests and reveals itself, we have arrived to the second term that is taken as synonymous to witness, namely that of the testimony. To bear witness is to testify, but there can be no testimony that is not at the same time a testimonial. A narrative and a story that opens witness to interpretation and therefore to hermeneutics. The concept of a testament collects together all these nuances. The New Testament, for example, is a testimonial, a narrative, that testifies, that is, it bears witness to God's self-revelation, the phenomenon par excellence. That there should be a plurality of stories in such witnessing, such as the 4 Gospels, we don't have one Gospel, but 4 Gospels in the Gospel, is only necessary if witness is to be understood as offering an interpretation. The testimonial character of testimony implies and necessitates another and even a third. Returning therefore to our original observation of the testimony of our conscience and the interiority that it implied, I would like to raise the question whether the interiority of conscience already presupposes the opening to another, that is, whether intersubjectivity takes precedence over subjectivity. Yet, it will seem that by all accounts it is the I or the ego that enjoys a certain priority. After all, from what other vantage point the phenomenology is to carry his analysis but from what is immediately given to himself, namely his own I? And is not this I to which all phenomena appeal and appear in order to appear? Finally, is not this I, the transcendent ego, which unifies and individuates my consciousnesses, the Erlebnisse? How can I reach to the other if I do not begin from the I who I am, if I am not even that I? Hans Urs von Balthasar has such an I addressing God thus. It's a long quotation. Finally, you yourself have created me to exist within a prison, the prison of this my ego. In it I live, move, and have my being. And I love this ego, for no one hates his own flesh. This space is familiar to me. My thought illuminates it. My senses crowd with the world's concerns. My will expands it widely. In this monad, the universe is irretrievably reflected. Only within this interior space can I know the world, or even you. Everything must be measured according to its standards. Just as the eye can see only colors and the ear can hear only sounds, so too I can know anything, whatever, only in its relationship to myself. Even love is a law of this ego. No, I do not long to go outside of myself. What would be the good of an ecstasy of coalescing with nature or with a loved person if I could no longer experience them? How can I make you a gift of my love or offer you my ego in love if I no longer have this ego, if I am dispossessed of myself? This is my beloved dungeon. I yearn from no freedom. Yet, phenomenology has given a quite different answer, namely that the I that speaks so, as in the passage above, the I that denounces its freedom is itself nothing else but an invention of sheer unlimited freedom. It was Jean-Paul Sartre who first declared the ego to be an essentially artificial and superficial invention of the consciousness itself. He writes, "Perhaps in reality the essential function of the ego is not so much theoretical as practical. We have noticed indeed that it does not bind up the unity of phenomena, that it is limited to reflecting an ideal unity, whereas the real and concrete unity has long been effected. But perhaps the essential role of the ego is to mask from consciousness its own spontaneity." The question we need to ask is this: for what reason does the ego need to play this essential role of masking from consciousness its very spontaneity, that is, of hiding from consciousness what consciousness is, its very nature and essence? The answer is clear. Consciousness cannot bear its own freedom. It cannot stand itself. It always seeks to escape itself, either by its engagement with the world, that's the function that intentionality had played in the unreflected level, or by erecting the ego, in front of whose restrictive function consciousness can now cast itself, relieved from its own unlimitedness. Hence Sartre's enigmatic remark, consciousness is frightened by its own spontaneity because it senses this spontaneity as beyond freedom. Yet spontaneity is nothing else but another word for freedom here. Thus we have arrived to this enigma. What does a freedom beyond freedom could mean? Beyond freedom indicates a freedom that cancels itself out by being precisely free. So free that is restrained by its very inability and impossibility of being unfree. A freedom needs limits and restrictions in order to be perceived or perceive itself as free. That means that freedom is only a freedom towards this or that. Without limits, freedom falls upon itself. It becomes its own monstrous limit, that is, the very lack of any limit. Thus the ego saves freedom from itself by bringing it back to a place where there are restrictions and limitations, and therefore freedom can continue to be free by being limited. Consciousness anxiety on the face of its own spontaneity, what is elsewhere known as an existential vertigo or nausea, is underscored by the absence of the will. Sartre defines the will as an object which constitutes itself for and by this spontaneity, over which the will is powerless. The will directs itself, Sartre continues, upon states, upon emotions, or upon things, but it never turns back upon consciousness. Throwing myself off some heights, in the case of vertigo, is not an act of my will, but precisely the recognition that my will not to fall is rendered inoperative by the sheer spontaneity of my consciousness. In other words, the thought that if I were to fall down at this moment, nothing, not even my own self, not even myself, could prevent me from falling. Consciousness as an absolute seems to allow no room for a God. In fact, it assumes itself those attributes that theology traditionally assigns to God. Thus, consciousness is a cause of itself, causa sui, unlimited and thus infinite. Its representations are eternal, and so on. There is here the repetition of the old philosophical blasphemy that identifies seeing and knowing, theaume and theoria, and attributes both to God, theos, but also to the philosopher's ability to know. Consciousness, like a small God, can indeed regard everything from the point of view of its inscrutable interiority without itself being seen. In spite of such godlike characteristics, we have weakness, and this is the weakness that conscience brings against itself, the testimony of our conscience. Such is the promise fulfilled by the ego. Yet, as we have seen, the ego is only a superficial and artificial invention of the consciousness. Thank you. What for a moment appeared as the promise of a saving God, now becomes nothing more but a false idol. The ego is the golden calf that consciousness, in a telling idolatrous moment, erects for itself. In the invention of the ego, consciousness implicitly recognizes itself as unfree in its unlimited freedom or unable to endure such a freedom. Its struggle and misery, its inevitable subsequent being at odds with myself, becomes precisely from knowing that it itself has no master and it itself cannot completely fool itself in believing that it is its own master. At the end of this analysis, the ego emerges as the process and at the same time as the end result of fooling oneself, as a self-deception, into believing to one's self-mastery or autonomy. Thus, the ego is not so much a false God, or rather it is a false God only insofar as it is a false other. For by the self-deception of its autonomy, consciousness hides its radically heteronomic structure. That is, it hides from itself, or it forgets that what constitutes it, what gives it to itself, is precisely a givenness anterior than any self-constitution. As Jean-Luc Marion writes, that which gives itself only to the one who gives himself over to the call, and only in the pure form of a confirmation of the call, which is repeated because received. Receptivity is thus constitutive of a subject without subjectivity. It should be noted that the subject does not even exist prior to the call. The self that gives himself over to the call does not have even himself. In order then to give himself over to the call, he has to be given that self. In fact, this is not about a sequence. The self is not first given in order to be later given up, but rather the self is given as much and insofar as it is given up. For the self too, or rather the self above all, must be given. Thank you.